I think anyone who finds vulnerabilities thinks that way. I think it's only people who can't find vulnerabilities who start to maybe say, oh, this isn't a good idea, because sometimes when you're just, investigating software, you find vulnerabilities, and then what do you do with them? So, the responsible thing is to send it to the vendor, but then you get stuck with the vendor doesn't do anything about it if there isn't the threat that it will be publicly disclosed. So I think the public disclosure is the only way to actually, get things fixed.
I would even add that if people find any silent fixes in patches, they should go ahead and disclose that out too. If they have reverse engineered a patch and found that something was silently patched, they should throw that out to public too, just for the knowledge of it. Because sometimes we have seen that things patch silently getting exploited in the wild.
Anyone else?
I'll do it. Yeah. I think you should, and most hackers think that you should not disclose vulnerabilities to the public. Instead, you should sell them to me. And so if you guys have vulnerabilities, then I recommend we talk offline and you make some cash.
I thought selling, being a salesperson up here was off limits. I didn't hear that. Okay.
Seriously. So I have a question.
Yeah.
So you say you want us to sell our vulnerabilities to you. How can you afford to pay the worth of a vulnerability?
Well, how much is yours worth?
Well, let's say something like, let's throw out the internet worm, the original, the one that had that much impact. How can you ever afford to pay what the impact of that worm was?
Are you talking about the Robert Morris one?
Take something that's had major impact on the net.
Let's take something that we were mostly all alive for.
All right. Well, there's a lot of valuable business models that organize themselves around buying exploits, which are the sort of fruit of your labor, and of course vulnerabilities, which are potential exploits. One way that Immunity capitalizes on this is to have a program which we call the Partners Program, which we sell to IDS companies and other people who want to have up-to-date research. And so when a vulnerability is, for whatever reason, announced publicly, perhaps it's been given to a vendor, we need to be able to put it into the Partners Program as soon as possible. But to get something to the point where we understand it and can report on it is going to take us 3 to 6 months. So for us to have instant reaction, we need to know ahead of time. Now, there's many ways to do this. We could cooperate with all the major vendors, do exactly what they want us to do, and in return, they would give us pre-release information. Or we can cooperate with the hacker community. And of the two, I'd prefer to cooperate with you, sir. So if you would like to sell vulnerabilities, then I am at your leisure.
Why is it either, not both?
Why is it either, not both? And the reason for this is because, I mean, obviously you cooperate both, but each vulnerability is going to come with strings attached. When I buy your vulnerability, there's going to be a contract. We're buying a license to software. When I get something from Oracle, there's going to be a contract, and then the lawyers get to negotiate, and you live in a sort of a caged world. So, like any business, you have to decide which one is more cost-effective.
Okay, time for you to pass the mic now.
Yeah, sorry.
Where's it going?
To you if you want it.
It goes to you or to Marcus Lindstrom? I think vendors have a real responsibility to, first of all, respond to vulnerabilities when they're reported to them and demonstrate to the community that they appreciate the work that they're doing by fixing the vulnerabilities. And second of all, to encourage other people to find vulnerabilities and to report them, hopefully before they announce it publicly. But either way, as a vendor, I appreciate the work that's going on there. I appreciate getting a little heads up for the rest of the planet so we can fix the vulnerabilities before everyone's taking advantage of the vulnerability and potentially hurting users. But either way, I would rather see the vulnerability out there than, not see it at all and potentially have people being at risk with no patch available.
How much heads up is heads up?
Well, we fix things pretty quickly, so we'll take whatever you want to give us. I would appreciate 30 days, but things better than finding out about it at the same time, starting a patch at the same time the hackers start, or well, the attackers start going after our users. But you know, I'll take what I can get.
All right. So I'm going to say that it is not all right to put vulnerabilities out. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is that the vast majority of actual exploits have occurred after the vulnerability was released or made public. And consequently, when it is not put out there, there is no real large-scale vulnerability to itself. Vendors absolutely have a moral responsibility to fix things, and saying, well, they won't do it is kind of like saying, well, you know, if people are out there speeding, we should be allowed to shoot them. That two wrongs do not make a right. That's not what I'm saying at all. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that vendors have a responsibility to fix them, but it needs to be done quietly.
What if vendors don't own up to
That
that responsibility?
you're talking about something that is essentially a moral problem, that people are doing the wrong thing, and people who are not fixing vulnerabilities are doing the wrong thing, and we need to come up with a way to solve that, and just endangering innocence is not the way to punish the people who are actually guilty.
Okay, so you brought us a problem. Now give us a solution.
How about legislation? How about liability? How about liability?
That's what we need. We need more laws.
Oh, hold on, I have something for Marcus. What do you say? What do you say to the fact that there are people out there on the internet that get very upset when their vulnerability is disclosed, which they knew about? So there are people out there who find vulnerabilities, don't disclose them, and use them to commit crimes, and they get very upset when someone goes and discloses it to the vendor. Does it, and the vendor then releases a patch, and then everyone knows about it and patches their systems. So the fact that there are criminals out there that are very upset with the way disclosure is going on right now, isn't make it pretty much factual that we're harming them?
Okay. So you're saying what about people who are using vulnerabilities to commit crimes and they don't like them being disclosed? Well, they are one of the people who are benefiting from it, and of course they're not going to like it, but that's sort of an irrelevancy. I mean, the thing is that if somebody else finds it, of course there are always going to be people who know about vulnerabilities and use them for wrong. But if you know about it and you are a good guy, then you should tell the vendor, and the vendor should fix it.
Okay, so how long is too long to practice responsible disclosure? At what point does a responsible researcher become an accomplice to a complicit vendor? Anyone?
I'll take it. All right. So the first thing I think we should note is that responsible disclosure is a marketing term invented by Microsoft and our Mr. Weld Pond over here and a few other people who wanted to make sure that they could try to push through legislation that made what we do illegal. It's a very simple strategy because there's no other way to restrict the market. There's clearly a market in vulnerabilities. And Marcus Lindstrom thinks that most vulnerabilities are exploited after they're released, which is flat out wrong. In reality, the hacker community finds the vulnerabilities, exploits them, and then 10 years later we're reading about them on, I guess it used to be Bug Track, but now it's full disclosure. So I mean, when we say responsible disclosure, what we're really doing is playing into Microsoft's and every other big vendor's hands and playing into the idea that they should restrict the ability that we have to do research today. And it's something that we should be very careful about avoiding. To play the politics game, you need to have talking points. And when people say responsible disclosure, you should think vendor monopoly disclosure. And we make sure we push this term out, and you guys are all now part of this game. And we can make sure that we sort of counteract this, because it's not actually good for Microsoft and Oracle and Sybase to restrict vulnerability disclosure. And it's not good for them in a very real, coherent, long-term sense. But short-term, it's good publicity to have everyone shut up. And that's what they want. That's what they want. They want legislature, like you said.
So it's really clear that it's not good for you for that sort of...
Well, it's not good for any vulnerability researcher or the public at large.
Wait a second here. Wait a second here. What is the harm to a researcher to wait 30 days before disclosing and give the vendor a chance to fix it? What is the real harm?
Press.
Bad press.
Well,
I mean, the reason is I tried to do responsible disclosure. I notified the vendor first, and then I wait, and then I was released disclosure so that people like me and you can go out and run our own signatures while we're waiting for your patch to be deployed. It takes a long process to get that out the pipeline.
so your complaint is the process is too long, but you're not giving a time which is acceptable.
But during that time, someone else is going to find it. If I find a blazingly obvious security hole, I'm going to notify the vendor. I'm going to give a time for a response, and then I'm going to put it out on full disclosure so that the rest of us can be protected from it before someone else finds it.
But when you put it out on full disclosure, you're telling everybody about it, so you're guaranteeing.
It's true, but on the same token, a lot of these are blazingly obvious, and
So,
The question is, are they obvious before they fix it?
Right.
And
Okay.
the fact that things eventually get found doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get found by 50,000 people around the world at the exact same time.
I've submitted a poll. I've submitted a poll. Last week.
okay, so I have something. I think you're saying that if you wait, then you will lose essentially the cred that you would get out of the. Well, then what? Then.
Start this with you this time. Just hold on to that.
Because I didn't have the opportunity to tell other people on my other peers what really was so that they could write appropriate signatures for it.
Well, you can practice self-defense. You can
Right.
you can mitigate it in your own environment.
So
what
my
you're
company will be protected, but
Everybody else is screwed. Right.
yeah, exactly.
No, that's
I'm saying
vulnerability
I'm
has
saying
mitigation.
for a small window of time.
Now, if vulnerability has some mitigation,
Yes.
then it should be published so that other people can protect themselves from that thing.
What if the only mitigation is to not run the software?
What if the only mitigation is protected from the network?
Yeah.
It's still a viable option for production services. You cannot make a judgment on somebody else's needs for production.
Some companies will go out of business if they have to shut down their systems for a significant amount of time.
And that's a risk they assume. You can't assume that risk.
and that's why we try
And
to
that's what you're trying to do.
I think
Okay.
more that they're trying to control the whole process. The whole idea of one process, the next step is now there's a third-party government branch that vets the process and constricts what you say and what you do. That's the game. The game is right now we get everyone to agree that there's something called responsible disclosure we should all do. Next game is then we make it mandatory. And after that we put people in jail. That's what you're feeding. You feed the beast.
Well, that goes back to another interesting point. Once you start proactively shipping zero-day rules and IPSs, can't people just reverse engineer the IPS and get the rules out?
Dude, who
Right,
works?
tell me that no one has ever been able to
Let's-
crack DDI?
Let's talk to the ZDI guy about
Well,
that.
I mean, the IPS vendors definitely make sure, ensure highest level of encryption, right? I mean, we make that the package is not getting cracked.
It's DRM. Once it's on the box, it has to get encrypted somewhere to get used.
Yeah, sure, but I mean, if you make sure that the bar is very high, and so far, I mean, we have never heard of any ZDI ones getting, reverse engineered.
Who would tell you?
What?
Who would tell? Who
I
would
mean-
tell you if they were able to reverse engineer something?
Okay, we have enough IPSs deployed around the globe watching the activity that if somebody disclosed and was actively exploiting it, we would know of it. I can make that claim.
Best offense is a good offense, I guess.
All right. So next question here. Am I on? I don't think so, but all right. No, it's okay. I don't want feedback. So paying for vulnerabilities. There's a couple ways to slice this one. Should vendors set bounties for vulns in their products? We have a vendor on the panel. Start with her.
So I'll start that. So we have at Mozilla what's called the Bug Bounty Program, and it's not necessarily intended to be paying for vulnerabilities. It's more rewarding the work that the community is doing to identify in our products and helping us secure the product. So it's more like a thank you. It's not on the same level as some of these vulnerability markets where they're actually paying and significantly more than we do. Our bounty is $500 for a critical Firefox vulnerability. It's a thank you. It's not the same as the market here that's saying, oh, this is worth X and this is worth Y. Ours is just kind of a thank you for supporting the community.
But how many vendors do you think, so if you think of realistically, if you want to have a bug bounty need to have researchers who are dedicated for, even when the problem comes in, to verify if it is a real problem. And how many vendors do you think would be able to even do this kind of a stuff? Like, I mean, big vendors probably, but all the small vendor software, they don't have even the research pool to do this kind of stuff.
So all vendors have a mechanism by which customers can report other kinds of bugs, so why not security bugs? If a customer is not able to deploy their software in this environment because of an application compatibility and, issue, they have a mechanism by which they address bugs, other kinds of bugs, so why not security bugs? I don't think that's a reasonable...
I can answer that because I've run into a lot of those problems. Those mechanisms are all set up for people who've got paid support contracts with a lot of companies. So unless you're paying for support, you don't even have access to the email addresses and websites and phone numbers that you, for the standard reporting mechanism. So you end up reporting to, you know, the PR person at the company or the investor contact or the webmaster, and then they don't know what to do with it. So, I mean, you have to have a process. You can't just have the standard bug process, because...
I agree that they should, but as a researcher, we see what happens when you can't find the right contact, or if you send it to PR and it disappears into a black hole. Eventually what happens is that it ends up on full disclosure.
Okay. Marcus, do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, I'll say that if you have a QA department, then you have people to verify things. If you are one developer, you have to verify bug reports, and you have staff to do it. And the argument that only big companies can do these things is like saying that only big companies can develop software. There is no difference between the claims.
Well, I mean, what I have seen sometimes people submit is like when a Windows crashes, they go and submit that information to the ZDI thinking that it probably is a vulnerability. And people, not everybody is able to probably read, even the QA engineers are not going to be necessarily able to read all those dumps and figure out if there was a problem or if there was not. So it does involve significant skill in some cases to verify whether the problem is real or not.
If you're getting so many bugs that you can't go through them, you have real problems that go beyond what we're describing here.
Actually, that's probably the case for every vendor. Every vendor probably has more reports than they can go through in a reasonable amount of time. We get a lot of reports. It takes a lot of time to figure out if there's actually even a potential security issue here, and we take them all seriously. But it's a huge problem if you've got a lot of different reports, and a lot of them, there's a lot of the signal to noise ratio is not necessarily. For a lot of vendors without dedicated staff on security issues, it's definitely a difficult thing to do, but the vendor needs to dedicate staff to this sort of thing, and you're not going to be able to get away with not having a mechanism to address security reports.
Go ahead.
Okay.
You got something else?
You see some of these, I have seen some of these ActiveX controls, right? People distributing to wide range of software. This is like a shop which has no clue about security. You even tell them that now there is a hole in that ActiveX control, right? They have absolutely no clue what you're talking about. And this recently happened. Actually, one of the big vendors, I want to name the vendor, it's a big vendor for web portal software, right? And we reported a bug for their software, and they came back as saying, we're going to sue you now because you reported a bug for us. And they had they have no clue as to what a security issue is, how to handle it, and these things kind of get disclosed, and they have to live with it. There are vendors ranging on all scales. There are, I would call sophisticated vendors such as yourself, Microsoft, who have the process, and then there are on the other extreme, they don't have a clue of what you're talking about. So it's very difficult for vendors, I would say, to set up a program when the range of skills they have is really variable.
Okay, that brings us to the next part of that question is, should all vendors set bounties of some sort or reward programs, put them in place? Does it make sense for certain types of vendors as opposed to others? Is there a cutoff point depending on size or complexity of the problem? There was a ZDNet blog that was out that was asking the question, should Microsoft pay for vulnerabilities?
If you're saying that all vendors should pay bugs for bounties, then that means that an individual developer is paying out of their pocket for something. It means that people who are developing open source software will not only not get any money, but will be paying things out. That everyone ought to do it, clearly you can't do that because there are some people who develop for free.
Well, I would also add the business case doesn't add any justification. Like, think of it as Mozilla, right? Let's say ZDI finds a bug for you. You're not paying those $500, right, from Mozilla's pocket. Similarly, if a Microsoft is right now getting stuff free, right, let's say from ZDI, why would Microsoft then go ahead and invest in a team and probably just get a couple of days lead over what we report to them. You know, like it doesn't, the cost versus the benefits don't make sense for a vendor to kind of go into this program. Like, I mean, like let's say all the Mozilla bugs, if you did not have a bounty program and they came from us, right? You would save your whatever. I mean, the dollars you save is not huge for you, but for somebody else, the dollars may be significant. And plus, you are also saving on all the researchers you need to employ to kind of figure out those bugs and all that. So the cost versus the benefits you are getting from the program necessarily may not make sense for all the vendors.
So your opinion is that it doesn't matter whether the vendor pays for it or an outsourced third party. It's irrelevant. Somebody's paying for it.
Yes.
Yeah, someone's paying for it.
So I have a question about that. For vendors that say that they, like Mozilla says, they'll give $500. That's great. That's kind of a drop in the bucket, but it is a nice gesture. At what point does, when a vulnerability researcher finds something and they, let's say I found a Linksys one and I called up Linksys and I said, hey, you have this hole, I can see SNMP through your firewall, and I spent a month doing this work and I want some payment for it, and they say $500. And I say, good, I'm going to disclose it tomorrow. At what point does it become extortion? Because we spend all this time doing this work, and we're not getting fair compensation for it. They're using us, the community, as an outsourced security system. So like I said, I appreciate the gesture. I think it's the right way to go, and I think your business model has a lot of idea. But for everybody else, if they say, "Oh, we'll give you $1,000," at what point does it become extortion? When I say, "Hey, I spent a month on this. I ain't gonna take $1,000. What's going on there tomorrow?"
Or if
At
they
the
say
point
they're
when
not going to give you anything.
At the point where you begin the work and you start to do the research, find the vulnerability, verify it, write the exploit. While you're doing all that work, you're not engaged by the corporation to do any work for them. So when you come to them and say, give me $1,000, or I'm going to put it on full disclosure, or give me $10,000 or $100,000, like where do you draw the line? The point is that there's no existing relationship with the company, and they haven't said, like Mozilla has said, hey, if you find one of these vulnerabilities, we'll pay $500 bug bounty for critical vulnerabilities. If there's no existing relationship and you are now demanding money, or else you will do something that will harm the company, then that's extortion.
People do business all the time when there's no business relationship. I look out there and I see that there's a certain need out in the marketplace, and I do research and I build up some intellectual property, and then I can go and sell that to companies. Couldn't I research a vulnerability, write a paper about it, write the exploit, write the mitigation to it, and say, here's a paper I wrote. I'll sell it to you for $50,000. Take it or leave it. And now I think disclosing it might be extortion, right? But selling intellectual property to a company can't be extortion. Disclosing it is. Because it's I'm going to do this or else.
Yeah, the minute that you say give me something or else, then it becomes extortion.
Fair enough. So then how long do you wait before it doesn't become extortion?
Okay, so yeah, we're getting into the next part, which is paying for protection. So going through a middleman, going through someone who buys vulnerabilities from the community and does something, either what iDefense does with them, which is sell them to a subscriber list, or what ZDI does, which I will let you talk about. How does this, does this equate to paying, mafia protection money? How many dons do you have to pay off to be fully covered? Take it away.
So we do buy vulns from the Zero Day Initiative program, and we do put filters in the intrusion prevention system to protect all our customers. But when the number of filters that are protecting the zero-day vulns versus the number of filters that are protecting everything else, the latter is much more than what the zero-day vuln protection is. And to be honest, like in many cases, what happens is people have really not even gone and upgraded their software from NT and 2000. So they are really not, when they are buying an IPS, they are buying protection for those systems that they are not patching for years. I recently spoke to one of these vendors, and they haven't patched their Solaris systems for like 7 or 8 years because they don't want to disrupt any energy utilities and all that program. So they are buying IPS actually for protecting from all the vulns which already have been disclosed. And yeah, the ZDI definitely adds more, that it gives them zero-day protection too, but they are not paying, we are not saying that they are paying only for the ZDI. What protection they're getting for others is definitely more important than just the ZDI part.
Well, one interesting thing when I look at this paying for protection is when the software vendor is actually selling security products to protect their own technology, and this is something that Microsoft actually does. They sell something which basically fills the gaps between their design and how people are attacking the system, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think people say, you know, that's a very similar situation, that you're paying for protection.
Anybody else?
I'll say yes, it's paying for protection.
Okay. All right. Yeah, please.
I'm going to make an observation between the last two questions. You're basically talking about intellectual property. In one case,
the vendors or the researchers? Who's
is creating intellectual property. But the bottom line is your independent intellectual property doesn't impact my business in one case, if it's original thinking. But if you're doing original research on a problem, I see possible two deviations. You may get the extortion. You may want to get the credit, like the person in the back of the room was saying. But also take a look at it as a lot of the problems that you see today are discovered in because some of the seeds of the initial discussions for research were planted maybe a year ago, and all of a sudden you have two or more independent researchers coming up with the same thoughts.
Well, this is an important point, right? Like, the fact is, you are not a unique little sunflower. The
Yes, I am.
all right. I mean, aside from you, but there's a lot of people out there who know the difference between a small string and a big string, and it's just not that hard. So everyone thinking that, oh, if I disclose it, it's the end of the world, that's retarded. The hackers had it years ago. Everyone knows about it. You're just another, you know, canary in the shoebox, which is not a real analogy. I just.
You're looking at script kidding to me, is what you just discussed.
The script kiddies are better than people. I mean, people don't give them credit. They sit around doing a lot of work, but and they're smart people. So, you know, and they're going to make a lot of money.
I agree with the last day, with the previous one, no.
All right. I mean, who do you at all these you know, vendors in their security departments, right? It's not. Yeah. I don't know.
I was going to say, this is kind of what draws the line between the cumulative us and the cumulative them. If you start taking your rent processes down that line of, I'm going to extort all this money from you, you become one of them. I get paid by my company to protect my company. Now, I'm going to get paid by them whether or not, you know, these vulnerabilities get disclosed by or not, but I'm going to do the best job that I can because it's something that I enjoy and it's a community that I like to support. That's what makes us us.
Good for you.
I don't think that we're, I won't lie and say I'm not in it for the money at all. And, you know, getting the values or whatever is a nice perk on top of that. But I'm still going to be doing this work because that's what I get paid to do.
And I assume you enjoy it.
And I do enjoy it.
So you don't have any problems.
But I mean, you know, why would we start taking that leap into extortion and it's a point where, you know, we're just our career?
I think this brings up an interesting point, and this sort of comes up in arguments all the time, especially with the complete anti-disclosure people, like on the end there, is motivation matters. Like, if I'm doing this to make money, somehow it's what I'm doing is wrong. If I'm doing it for the goodness of society, somehow it's good. If I'm doing it just to make myself look better and be more marketable, that's sort of a gray area. You know, I mean, why does the motivation, you know, matter? If I
Motivation matters for one very simple reason. When you reach a point where you have to make a decision about when and how you disclose, and something's on the border, those motivations make the difference between what's better for society and what's worse for society. It's fine in a lot of the clear-cut cases where it just so happens that what's better for society also matches up with what's better for your career, what's better for your own personal edification, and what's better for your wallet. But those don't always line up. And when they don't, that's why the motivation.
If motivation matters, who decides what motivations are good and what aren't? Why can't we decide based on the facts on the ground, not what was in the person's head who is doing it? Because I may behave differently than Dave here. And I might be saying, you know, Dave might be in it for the profit motive, and I might be saying, well, I think I'm just doing it because I want to make myself look more impressive to everybody. Okay? We might be doing the exact same thing, but...
Exactly why our legal system works the way that it does. It's preponderance of evidence and all this other kind of stuff, but that's why some people people, give some people the death penalty and other people get involuntary manslaughter. It's the intent that you try to determine, and we determine a different sort of scale of punishment based upon that, because the motivation matters, because in those sorts of cases you get those borderline situations where an involuntary manslaughter is something that wouldn't have otherwise happened in a lot of other cases, whereas premeditated murder would have happened regardless of this particular subset of
Okay, so let's take a concrete example. Let's take a zero-day disclosure that causes harm. If I was doing it because I really thought that was the best thing to do and I had no profit motive, you wouldn't throw me in jail. But if Dave did that and he had a profit motive, you'd throw him in jail?
Not necessarily.
So let's talk about you're saying motivation matters, but how does it actually, when does it actually mean something except you just saying, I like this person, I don't like that person?
I think what he's saying is, what's the effect of the vulnerability on society?
If the effect is the same, though, but the motivation was different.
I'm just saying the motivation's different. The is the same.
I'm saying, suppose the vulnerability is in a heart monitoring machine as opposed to Microsoft's.
That's you're mixing what I've posed as a question.
The only reason you're going to go to court is when somebody determines that the vulnerability may have been used to affect society wrong.
But by that standard, Microsoft can argue that any vulnerability in Microsoft can negatively impact society. And Sun can do the same thing. Oh, you take down, if you have a Solaris vulnerability, you can take down the power grid.
Disclosing is not the same as using. Disclosing is you publishing a paper to bug track. Let's not get big heads about it, right? Like, so the fact that you disclose is not you creating anything. You have said something. Your words. It's not like you're an orator of such great skill that the moons have shifted.
I can agree with that one. If I say, hey, there's $1 million in a Shmoo bag in the knock right now, you're telling me all I've done is give you information.
Yeah, that's great.
The money disappears, and that's okay.
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that it's extortion when you say that.
I want to hear from Marcus Lindstrom over here.
If it disappears, it isn't my fault. What about fire in a crowded theater?
Right.
That's, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, what he
Okay,
said,
go
intent
for
does
it.
matter. I mean, intent is an important part of both the legal system and morality itself. And you can't then say, oh, but let me give you this case and how would you decide it, because that is up to whoever has to decide it, a judge or a jury, or in many cases even just, the cop on the beat who decides whether or not somebody should be busted. But intent does matter.
Okay, so if intent matters, what about who are we really responsible to when we're talking about responsible disclosure? Are we responsible to the vendor? Are we responsible to the customer? Are we responsible to the industry at large so that Adam Shostak has some data to go by when he does his next analysis? I mean, at what point do we say that responsible researcher is trying to work with the vendor because there's a serious flaw that could affect society in a negative way, and then the vendor is dragging their feet, or they may or may not have legitimate reasons of why it's taking them so long? At what point, and who's to call whether or not it's time to disclose? Who's going to benefit from dropping that?
Different situations, though. In her case, she's getting paid by somebody to protect her customers. So she's actually got the easy case, right? Because she's getting paid by her company to protect her company. And if she discloses this is up to her company, it's kind of like Avi yesterday with Johns Hopkins. He goes through Johns Hopkins. That's great for them. What about the guy sitting at home that comes up with stuff?
And the fact is, it's going to cost him a good $2,000 to disclose it. He's going to have to deal with whatever ramifications he goes through. He's going to have to talk to the company for like another 8 hours, explaining them in great detail how painfully obvious it is that this vulnerability. I mean, if you had like $5 for every time you submitted something and they said that's not a vulnerability, there wouldn't be no need for ZDI and iDefense and immunity.
So what if the vendor agrees that there's a vulnerability, they agree on the severity level with you, but they don't agree on the timeline for disclosure? What happens then? Who decides? Who decides?
A lot of it comes down to loyalty so much, a little more than responsibility. My loyalty is to my community. My community has been there for me since I was, a kid playing on my computer, and my community is going to be after I leave my crappy job. And so my loyalty has been to the community. I want to make sure that I'm protected and the company that's paying me is protected, but I want to make sure that her company and his company and their companies are protected as well, because it's the community that I'm a part of.
Right. So what if you've So what if, yeah.
It's an important thing. If you're going to be paid by your employer to have a particular job, and your loyalty is not to the employer who's paying you, who's allowing you to do this, they have the which is why they hired you. So my point in that is just that they need to know exactly what they hired. And I commend you if you've done that, but it's a very important thing that they understand when they're.
Okay, so I want to ask. Oh, go ahead.
Back to Katie's question about, you know, how long is a reasonable amount of time. In general, the researcher has all the power in this relationship. In general, occasionally, if you're reporting to an enormous vendor that has a lot of credibility in the press, or you know, a enormous legal team, then maybe they have some power in the relationship. But really, the researcher has all the power in this relationship. So they control when they are when they disclose it. They control whether or not you know, the vendor is doing something. The idea of whether or not the vendor is in a reasonable time frame to this sort of thing. So the vendor really has to take the position that, okay, so the researcher gave me this information and they can make it public at any time. How do I convince the researcher that by waiting for a patch to be available, they're doing the best thing for the community at large? And one of the ways they can do this is by being transparent about the overall process. Okay, well, this is the stage the bug is in. Okay, well, this is how many different components it touches. This is why it's going to take us, you know, 14 months to fix this particular. Is 14 months, which is, you know, like 12 months I think is the range where it's pretty ridiculous that you know, the fix isn't out there, but it happens, and sometimes it's almost reasonable, and you know, sometimes it's because it's not necessarily a priority for that vendor. So the researcher is the one who gets to decide, you know, is it time to go public with this particular vulnerability. So as a vendor, what I try to do is demonstrate to the researcher that we're working on it, we're taking it seriously, we're trying to get a patch out as quickly as possible, and hope that the researcher has the same goal that the vendor does, which is to protect the user.
Yeah, I think what do you do when the research is not, in other words, there's a conflict between the research thing is reasonable time and what the vendor has to do to, you know, mark that goal, because there's, you know, verification of the vulnerability, you know, testing, deployment of the patch. There's a whole series of steps that have to, I mean, you just don't deploy the patch. There's a lot of things, as you know. And if the researcher, you know, doesn't believe that you're, you know, that you have to do those things, or he doesn't agree with your timeline, what do you do then? Does the researcher, do you still go by his timeline?
Well, they have the data, and there's nothing stopping them from disclosing it, so they really can. So there's nothing that the vendor can really do in this instance except to try to convince the researcher that they're working on the vulnerability, that they're taking it seriously. There's really, you know, nothing else that they can do.
In our experience, usually what has happened is when you talk to the researcher back, like usually you get emails like, hey, I told you this bug about 6 months back. What are you guys doing about it? And what is the vendor doing about it? Why it is not fixed? And when you kind of walk them through the whole process, and these are very intelligent people, I mean, needless to say, they're able to understand that once you tell them saying the vendor needs to correct this bug over like 30 languages, he has to make these many QA cycles. I mean, they are reasonable, and so far we have always found that making the process very transparent does help and does convince researcher to hold off from disclosing stuff to the public.
So let's hear from the researchers over here.
I don't agree that the vendor has all the power. I mean, the researcher has all the power. I think that what vendors will do is they'll threaten you. They'll threaten you with legal action. We see a lot of threats. We see a lot of cases that have been dropped. But you know, being threatened with legal action isn't necessarily, you know, something that is easy to be on the receiving end of. It takes time. It takes energy. I mean, we saw recently with the HID case with the RFID tags that basically, what was it? IOActive had to basically back down and say, we're not going to present this. Now, who knows whether HID would have prevailed or not in their case? They probably wouldn't have. But it's those legal threats, especially when the person works at a company. And I can tell you that, you know, when we were working at Stake, there was if you pissed off a vendor, well, that vendor was going to trash your name throughout the industry and say they're just not responsible researchers. They're harming. I'm not going to do business with them. And you'd have banks say, I'm not going to do business with people who operate that way and don't give the vendor enough time.
But lots of researchers dump things to full disclosure all the time, and nothing happens. So they really can get away with it and not face any impact.
If you're willing to do it completely anonymously, you can get away with anything, pretty much.
Sure. Okay, Dave, do you have something to say about this? Less than 10 minutes? Okay. So I want to get to what makes a good vendor from a researcher's perspective, and what makes a good vendor from a customer's perspective. So, you know, is a good vendor someone who pays bounties? Is a good vendor someone who doesn't sue researchers? from a researcher's perspective. From a customer's perspective, what's important to a customer? Is it important to the customer that the researcher has a bounty program to proactively reward the community for their research? Important to the customer that the vendor sues everyone who tries to rattle their software that they depend on for their critical infrastructure? Go ahead, Marcus Lindstrom.
I'll say that results matter, that what matters to the customer is having software that doesn't have problems. And that's what really matters. And anything else like bug bounties, anything else, it depends completely upon what it ends up being for the end user, who is the innocent party in all of this, who may get some sort of information loss, etc.
So all software is going to have problems, and I'm not just a vendor, I'm a user too. For me, the most important thing is how fast is a vendor shipping a patch. Like once a vulnerability is identified, how long does it take the vendor to get a patch out there?
So from the researcher's perspective, what makes a good vendor?
I think it's how everyone is saying that the end user is an innocent party, as if they were a blind mole rat just chewing through tunnels here, and that's really where. What's that? All right. Well, that's where the software
Wait a
industry
second. A
wants
user
them.
could be a company like Bank of America. They're not an innocent little mole rat. They have a very sophisticated IT staff that knows what they're doing.
Have you met these people? Yeah, especially them.
They're
the ones who are really.
We're in DC. Who might be the mole rats here, right?
Well, I think the reality is they want you to be a mole rat by sort of artificially restricting the information the end user is exposed to. And if we tie the word extortion, if we tie the word weapons and like all these things into what essentially is people putting text on a page into the discussion like we have today, that's where they win. And if you realize that the reality is that the more information the end users have, the more use of it, the more people like her can protect her network and all this other stuff, there's really no harm to the end user for any kind of disclosure. The harm is that they're using buggy software, and it's not. And if they know about it, they can protect themselves. It's a very simple equation, and the idea of responsible disclosure and all this sort of bankrupt sort of vendor monopoly stuff, it doesn't work.
One of the things that you're talking about is extortion from the research to the company. What about the extortion from the other way around when you're looking at the vendor who says, we're only going to fix this product, we're only going to release this fix if you pay our maintenance?
Exactly. The extortion is entirely the other way.
But how's that different? Where the only time we get access to your vulnerability information is if we pay you.
That's
so
right.
We're paying somebody.
Because it's very expensive for me to do this stuff.
But David have to you to give you that information.
Yeah, I have no. The thing is, I'm not saying there's an obligation. Exactly. There's no obligation on researchers to do anything with the vendors. The obligation is entirely their own moral compass, and that's the way it's now, and that's the way it's going to be. And responsible disclosure was a movement to try to prevent that. And we saw it early on, and we prevented it. Now there is a vulnerability marketplace, and it's basically dead. OIS is dead. It's good that it's dead. And there are people protecting your rights, and that's what this is. So if you use the word extortion, if you use the word weapons and all these things, you do play into their hands, and you help diminish your own rights. And I just hope to make you aware of that.
Okay, we got 5 minutes. One comment?
Well, I was going to say that Window made a really good point when she said that if you give us a timeline, the biggest things that I see people complaining about is people responding with, oh, this isn't really a vulnerability, or we don't think this is critical, and then 6 months later they release it. When you're hammering away six months in a row saying this is a really bad bug and it needs to be addressed, and you're not getting that sort of response from the vendor, I'm not going to go back and disclose to that vendor. If I can't get your response, I'm going to get everyone else's response and say, hey, this is out there and they're not addressing it.
Right. Well, you get form letters sometimes. This vulnerability will be addressed in the next critical patch update.
Well, I think that the more that the vendor takes responsibility in rewarding this behavior, in saying, here is our timeline, here is the process, here is a small token of our appreciation. The more that the vendor rewards that, the more you're going to get collaborative feedback, and you're not going to have to worry about suing me.
Okay, one more quick comment, then I want one more question to get in the 2 minutes. You had your hand up first.
Sure. I
Your vendor, you've got a slightly different dynamic when you've got open source projects.
I was just getting there. Just getting there.
Open source project probably patches really quickly, but the propagation to the users of the vulnerabilities so that they can upgrade is sometimes impossible.
Okay, I have data. So as an open source project, so actually I have numbers for 1505 to 1506. That's the update that happened. It's one of the updates security updates that happened last summer. It took us 8 days to upgrade 90% of our user base. So that's from the time the patch was available to the time 90% of the population was updated. So that's actually really short. Like if you asked like another vendor how long it takes you to get the population on a security patch.
How do you notify?
We have a number of different mechanisms by things that are reporting, and we actually also have a lot of partners that tell us what they're seeing across websites, which users are hitting them, and we have also the 1505s checking in and saying, give me, is there a patch available? Is there a patch available? And eventually, no 1505s are asking for it because they all have it.
Okay. Okay, so we're basically out of time. I thank you guys all for participating, although I didn't see except just one ball. Thank you. Fly up here. My goal was to have the most balls in the air of any talk at Shmoocon. You disappointed me, people. But great participation. I leave you with one last unanswered question, along with the rest of the unanswered questions, is basically, what about the growing numbers of web applications that are full of holes? How do we disclose them? Who cares? Who do we tell? Will we get in trouble for it? Probably. Thank you. Oh, I'm supposed to give this away. Who wants it? All right.
One of the solutions I would suggest is start an association of responsible researchers, have a code of ethics, and have an escrow arm of the FS so that when you do find something, you deliver it to the escrow agent to be delivered at some future date. And then you talk with the companies. The escrow agent's always going to be independent. They'll never know where to find it. And they've got the legal.
Hey, in a way, that's kind of what these brokers do, but they actually pay you money for it at the same time,
Yeah, but the bottom line is they're in profit themselves for the simple reason they can profit immensely from it, whereas the researcher won't. If you really have an altruistic view, you need to have a group, you need to have you need to have a sense of how should I do it.
Right. Thanks for your comments. Hi.
Do you handle Symantec's vulnerabilities with Symantec products, or
no.
you guys do the ISS?
No, we just do third-party vulnerabilities.
Okay. So if I knew about Symantec Zero Day?
No, you could, well, you report it to Secure at Symantec. You could report it to me, but I mean, I will report it. I will forward it on to Secure at Symantec. So, here you go.
Morning, Jack. Really? You need one of these. You don't have one yet? No, I mean for this presentation. I've only got like 4 left or 5 left.
We're supposed to get off of here now. I think I need to turn this to the... You're wearing a green shirt.
I should take care of your stuff.
For me or for giveaways?
It's strapped to my body and I have to go to the bathroom.
Original Mom's Attic smell.
Wow.
Yeah, let me get the original.
You want the walking mic?
Yeah, that's definitely. Greetings. Yes, I believe so.
I have no idea.
Hello, good morning. How are you? So the way you trip on. Yeah, I mean, you don't look like he was having me build a camera. I know. Amazing. Marathon running. I don't know, something's like a painting at home. Yeah. Hey, you know what? My wife is a day older than I am, and she has literally no gray hair at all. And I told her it's because I take better care of you than you take care of me. She said, watch it. I'm 52, so I'm born and raised down here. I know that. They say once you're over the hill, it's all downhill. I don't even know if they still make these anymore, Jack. The NSA had with the Elon satellite. It was like, uh-oh, we're not supposed to put that out. Yeah, I think it was a very short run, and then they like pulled them off the market. They said, we can't be doing satellites on NSA heads.
Well, there's another agency that does that. NRO. So it's a term thing.
Yeah.
You can use slides?
No. Okay. So we didn't have slides 30 years ago.
Sounds good to me.
You make it or break it based upon.
Well,
no laptops. Some Paxer shirts. My socially responsible effort to support towards the bread.
Of course. You know,
anybody wants one? Gotta get it fast because this is all there are. 20 of them. They're gone.